and we are recording. Okay, so let's go around. We're going to talk about it when Harry met Sally, but let's go around and just say your name, where you are in the world, and what you're currently writing. I'm Jeff. I'm in Baltimore, north of Baltimore, Maryland, and in the United States, and I am about to start the last round of edits on the Dialogue Doctor book. I'm supposed to start that February 1st, so that is coming February 1st. But yeah, that's me. Dave, why don't you go?
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm from upstate New York, and I'm working on the second act of manuscript for my first novel right now.
Nice. Very cool. Cassie?
Hi, I'm Cassie Newell, and I live near the Tampa Bay, Florida area, which is all about Gasparilla this weekend and a hockey game. So it's very crazy around here. And I am working on my next YA fantasy novel that I'm fiddling with. And we'll see if it works out that way. I'm having some trouble with it. So
yeah,
that's it.
Very cool. Tania?
Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm in Berlin, Germany, and I'm working on my first novel, the first draft. It's like a contemporary fantasy.
Nice. Maddie?
I am Maddie Dalrymple. I write the interior suspense novels and suspense shorts and Lizzie Ballard thrillers, and I am outside Philadelphia.
Nice. And Allie, first time jumping in with us?
Yes, I'm Allie. I'm in North Georgia. My first novel will go for line editing April 1st, hopefully, and it's a Christian thriller.
Nice. Very cool. Awesome. All right, so we're talking about When Harry Met Sally. Primary writer on this screenplay was Noah Ephron. There's 3 writers on it, but that's pretty typical for Hollywood screenplays, is my understanding, is they get passed around a lot. But if you're listed as the primary, it means you wrote at least 80%. It doesn't mean you were the first writer, but it means like somebody else might have started it and then you fixed it, but you wrote the vast majority of it. My understanding, though, from what I've read, is that Noah Ephron actually wrote the vast majority of this one, that she started it and finished it up. And there are a couple of people that came in and doctored some things. All right, what were our thoughts on the movie? How many times have y'all seen it? Was this anybody's first time watching it?
No.
It's 2. Nice.
I think I've seen it a handful of times, but it's been years since I watched it last.
Did it hold up?
Yes, and I laughed really hard at so many things. I think I enjoyed kind of the style of the history too, of the way things looked. I don't know. I'm 50, so yeah, that kind of cracked me up.
Yeah, Meg Ryan's hair takes a journey in this movie. Her hair has some definite modulations, character modulations.
Yeah.
Any other general thoughts on the movie?
Well, it's been years since I watched it, but as I was watching it, I thought about you. I'm like, no wonder he loves this movie. I mean, it's just like dialogue and more dialogue. It was great.
Yeah, I do. I watch this movie like every year, at least once a year. It's one of my favorites.
Do you really?
I do. I really love it. Anybody not like it? Was anybody like, meh? No? Nice. All right, good.
I mean,
okay, go for it.
For me, it was like the second time I've watched it. I don't know when. I'm not very emotionally attached to it.
Yeah.
And honestly, the first half of the movie, I was very annoyed at her as a character. I had to warm up to him, but the movie as a whole was good, but it's not, it didn't touch me very deeply.
Okay. Were you annoyed by Harry or Sally?
Harry.
Okay. Yeah, I think everybody is. He's obnoxious. Okay, great. So we got 4 characters in the movie, which is crazy, but there's only 4. There's a lot of people they talk about, but only Joe shows up at the beginning too. Technically there's 5, but there's Harry, Sally, and then Harry's friend Jess, and Sally's friend Marie, and then Sally's boyfriend Joe, who has a couple lines of dialogue, but that's about it. Everybody else is talked about, but not actually seen on camera or speaks. And they it covers it starts off right out of college, then has a time jump, and then all takes place within about a year of their lives, which is fascinating. So let's talk about the character voices. Which character did you most, I don't want to say connect with, but like which character spoke to you the most? Which character did you think had the most interesting character voice?
For me, it was Sally.
Okay.
hmm
What'd you like about Sally's voice?
Well, I don't know that I liked all of it, but it was the most interesting. It was the most fun to watch. Just partially her facial expressions were, I really liked them, and I was thinking, how can I write like that? How can I make a character on the page have those expressions?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, she has huge facial expressions, which are great. Super exaggerated. Yeah. Anybody else connect to Sally's voice or notice what Nora was doing with her voice through the script?
Can you define voice real quick? Like, what do you mean by that?
Real quick, Cassie. No.
A summary of define voice, because like there's certain things that I liked about Sally, but I found Harry more endearing and more typical. And so to me, pulling off the typical male of that time, I thought was really good.
Yeah. So there's 5 things that make up a character voice. There is the language they use, like the words they use. There is the topics they choose to talk about, which is a big deal with Harry. So the voice is part of what I love about what the voices do in this story, is that they definitely grow and modulate as the characters grow. So, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So there's the top, and I bring that up around topics because Harry's big modulation is around the topics that he talks about. So there's their vocabulary, there's the topics they talk about, there's their body language. So like Sally's giant facial expressions and exaggerated moments, which also modulate through the story. There's that body language. There is the construction of their utterances, which means like the amount of words they say at a time, how they're putting sentences together, how those, like, are there a lot of commas making run-on sentences? Are they short sentences with periods? Do they ask a lot of questions? That kind of stuff. And then there is their participation in a segment. So how often do they talk? How, especially in group scenes, how often are they in the back and forth, right? Like, so that's how I define character voice. So like we were talking about Sally's huge facial expressions, like that's definitely part of her character voice. And Allie, I would say if you're writing that, you want to make sure, like when we're writing it, there's a weird thing that happens between movies and like the difference between movies and novels. And I first really started to understand it through Robert McKee's book Dialogue, where he kind of breaks down the differences. But he talks about how in movies the character voice is very much portrayed and interpreted by the actor. So you have a medium between the writer and the consumer of the story, in that the actor is like living out this character voice, whereas in the novelist, there is nothing between our words and the reader's imagination, which is fantastic because we have more control, but it also means that we have to work harder to empower that imagination. Does that make sense? As a screenplay writer, you can trust that the actor is going to interpret this on their own, and it's almost like more of a team sport with the screenplay writer. Whereas with a novelist, you got to figure out like, okay, how am I going to portray her acting, her facial expressions? So before I like tell you what I would do, anybody have any ideas about how you would get those kind of big expressions in a character like Sally on the page? Has anybody ever written a character like that before?
I mean, I have characters in my first series that are very verbose and very opinionated, and I feel like Sally's that way.
She is, yeah, super
Um,
opinionated
Yeah.
on the
and-
side.
Yeah, on the side. No, not on the side is an opinion, just the sauce. Sorry. But I think that, you know, in writing that previous series, my goal for those particular characters was really direct, and the other people's reactions, the other characters' reactions to that would show how big it was. If that makes, I don't know if
It does make sense. Yeah. So
making
what you
sense.
were doing was you were like giving one character a lot of vocalizations, a lot of like words coming out of their mouth, and then having other characters physically respond, like their jaw
Yes.
dropped. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to like give those kind of like physical reactions, and it paints the way other characters respond to our character, definitely tells the reader how they should be responding to our character. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I would think like if I was going to do a character like Sally, you know, I think so often we tie body language into the emotional state of a character. We're like, oh, when somebody's sad, they look down, when somebody, or they cry, or, but there's a step there a lot of times we miss, which is body language also has very much to do with our personality or the displaying of our character voice. So I would, if I were wanted to really exaggerate Sally, I would like lay out like I have 15 body languages for her that, and I would give her 3 times the body language I gave anybody else.
Interesting.
So that it exaggerates her body language in comparison to the other characters. Because like you're saying, Cassie, like we don't just notice what is happening with our character, we notice how they compare and contrast to the other characters on the page. That's part of what makes character voices pop, is when they all are different, the differences in the character voices really start to show, right? Like, so if you give Sally a ton of body language in your novel, and you don't give Harry a ton of body language, because they're the two that are in conversation all the time, her body language is really going to stand out. Does that make sense? So that's what, and I would define like for every, you know, writing her for every like emotional reaction, I would try to find a couple pieces of body language to really show that. Like when she's embarrassed, especially the first of the movie, she does this thing where she looks down and she covers her face. And like, that's something that I would write in the novel. Like, you know, when Harry said, blah, 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 Sally recognizing that everyone was looking at her, you know, looked down at the floor and covered her face and walked as quickly as she could to the table. Right. Like that would kind of portray that, like, but you notice I didn't describe how Harry walked to the table. I just described how Sally walked to the table. So it like accentuates the difference in how they're in their body language and how they're behaving.
Right.
Yeah. Any other way that y'all would do that?
Well, I was thinking that it could be enhanced perhaps also by the other character's reaction to the body language, even if it's not intentional on Sally's part, to maybe just highlight it a little bit more.
Yeah, they do that. And Noah Ephron uses that technique in her screenplay in that scene. I actually have it written down. Scene 39, where Sally fakes an orgasm. And it's really about how everybody around her is responding. There's a fun moment between the movie and the screenplay. In the movie, an older woman who's actually the director's mom looks up and says, "I'll have what she's having." Not in the screenplay, but
yeah, that's classic.
Yeah, was added by the director later. But yeah, anyway, but that's definitely a way like how people react to her can accentuate her emotion too, which is good.
One thing that I really liked, and unfortunately, this is not an example. This is an example of something that would be hard to do in a book, not an example of how you could do it in a book, but the scene where they're in the restaurant and you can't hear anything. It's clear that she's ordering her very, very super specific meal, and the waiter's reacting, and Billy Crystal is reacting. But one thing I really liked about the portrayal of Sally is that she's like, where a lot of people, I think, are sort of ashamed, recognizing or ashamed of their OCD tendencies. She's like loud and proud about her OCD.
Yeah.
So you can tell that she's having the time of her life, giving the order about, the super specific order to the waiter, while the waiter and Harry are kind of rolling their eyes.
Yeah, it's a great moment. And here it is in the screenplay, just so we can see, like, what does it look like on the page, right? It's this like, you know what I like is apple pie a la mode, but I like the pie heated, and I don't want ice cream on the top. I want it on the side, and I'd like strawberry instead of vanilla. And if you have it, if not, then no ice cream, just whipped cream, but only if it's real. If it's out of a can, then nothing, not even the pie. No, just the pie, but then not heated, as the way to leave. Harry stares in Sally in disbelief. Now, so you can see that, like, just by like giving Sally this paragraph, because as we scan up, you'll notice that Sally only has like small expressions, right? Like the construction of her utterances are very small, especially early Sally doesn't say a lot. She asks a lot of questions until she's ready to order. And then when she's ready to order, we see this like confidence that she's going to grow into. So there's a nice, like, part of what Ephron does with her character voice that then Meg Ryan portrays for us is building this character who at first is very mousy, except for these moments where she's going to express an opinion, but then she grows into this voice through the scene, so that when we get down to like, if we go down to 24, where they're actually dating, and Ephron does this great thing with Sally. She uses a repeated scene for Sally to show growth. So there's 3 diner conversations, and in the first diner conversation, Sally's very embarrassed, right? Like, that's the scene where she's like, Harry is talking about you've never had great sex, and she's hiding. And then Harry does the whole thing about Sheldon. And then in the second one is in 24, we see that Sally is now like steering a conversation, and she's talking about her relationship with Joe like she talks about apple pie, right? We have this huge paragraph from her, and again, we're in a diner, it's just her and Harry, and again, they're talking about their like sexual relationship with other partners. And so that's what classifies this as a repeated scene, right? Like, we've got 2 characters in the same place having a similar conversation, but we can see that one character has grown. She's taken the like conversation about her salad and her dinner and applied it now to her relationship. So you can see her like coming into herself. And then the last time she does it is in scene 39, where she we see her voice grow again in scene 39, where she actually puts Harry on the defensive, right? Like, so Harry and Sally come to eat large for sandwich sandwiches. We're back at a diner, we're eating together, it's just Harry and Sally, and again, they're talking about their sexual relationships. And we get this moment in here where Sally actually turns, because she's quizzing him, typical Sally voice, how do you know? And she's like, he's explaining like, oh, I know that women enjoy being with me because of what I hear. And Sally pushes back. One of the first times she starts to push back, and then we get this scene where she pretends to have an orgasm, and everybody responds to her as like proof of the performance. So anyway, it's that like growing of her voice into that OCD that, like you were saying, Maddie, that she starts to inhabit until finally it becomes like actual confidence in her relationships with others. Anyway, I
think it's funny that they actually wrote out that what she does in the script instead of just saying Sally fakes having orgasms.
Yeah, it's brilliant, right? But this is what you do in a novel. This is exactly part of the reason I love Ephron's writing, is because it is so like translatable into a novel. Like, this is, if we wanted to do this, we wouldn't summarize. We wouldn't say Sally fakes an orgasm and Harry's embarrassed. We want the reader to live in that moment. So we would have to actually write it out and probably add in between here Harry's embarrassment as to build, like, to slow this moment down and to build it out. Have her do a couple lines, have Harry respond, have her do a couple more, have the restaurant respond and Harry get embarrassed, do a couple more, have the restaurant, start staring at her, have Harry get even more embarrassed, and then finally have her finish. And then you can have your couple paragraphs of exposition where everybody responds to her and Harry acknowledges with body language and not with his voice, which also is a modulation for him, by the way, because he, at the first of the movie, he has almost nothing to say. He never doesn't have an answer.
You know
Anyway,
what's interesting is I actually had my iPad with the script in front of me as I was watching the movie, because I'm that geeky person.
no, I do that too.
And I noticed there was not a lot of ad-libbing at all. There are
Right.
very few ad-libbed moments. I mean, the diner was certainly one, but very, very little. Like, I could read as they were talking at the same time. It was really quite amazing, because you can't do that with a lot of scripts.
Yeah, it's here's another one I love in scene 35, where, and I learned so much from this, because I'm like, oh yeah, if I want the reader to live in the moment, then the communication between them is really important. But like, this is that scene where she says, do it in a funny voice. And Harry's like, I've decided for the rest of the day, we're going to talk like this, repeat after me, repeat after me. May I have some pepper? May I have some pepper? Pepper, 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 right? Like, but she's writing out what this sounds like and forcing you to live in this seemingly inconsequential moment between the two of them. She's spelling this out. May I have some pepper on my poppycock? And you just have the character repeating each other, saying these weird things until finally we build to this moment of disheartenment where Harry steps out and says, do you want to go to a movie tonight? And she's like, I have a date. Right. So, but what's beautiful about the emotional flow of this scene is that she has this inconsequential thing they're doing that makes us laugh and connect to them because it feels so real, before she drops in the news that Sally's dating somebody else. So it's this really great emotional moment where she's like connecting you to these characters with their dialogue, with just having this weird conversation. She makes you sit in the weird conversation the whole time. She doesn't summarize it. It's not like camera opens to them laughing and then Sally says this thing. Noah Ephron knows, like, we got to sit in this moment where we connect to these characters and then we can drop this emotional weight. And I think it's the same for our novels, right? Like, if you want to have a moment of emotional weight, you got to sit in it. You got to spend some time there. You got to actually let us enjoy the emotions with the characters, but they don't have to be talking about anything specifically. They just have to be interacting, right? Like, and that emotional interaction can build so that then when you pull the rug out from under the reader, it creates this moment of real sorrow, right? Yeah. Anyway, but just talking about, we jumped way ahead. This is what happens when we do something I'm excited about. This is why we got to do like stories that I don't obsess over. So let's go back to character voices. We've talked about Sally's character voice. What did y'all see in any of the other character voices? We got Harry, Marie, and Jess still to talk about.
Let's see, for Harry, his sort of standard baseline voice was to kind of like manipulate conversations, as far as his pacing would be to interrupt people. And, when he talks for an extended period of time, in contrast to Sally, who, when she would speak, it would be in short sentences, maybe ask some questions. And and like in the screenplay, I noticed lots of or couple instances of nose crinkling being called out, like body language. Like, she doesn't express that, if she's annoyed with somebody so much, she kind of quiets down or uses body language to express disapproval. Whereas Harry, he'll let you know you know, if if he doesn't like something, and so that's where I see a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's great insight. I really love that. I also just realized a second ago that I was pointing at the script and talking about the script, but I wasn't actually showing you what I was talking about. If I do that, you have to yell at me because I don't know I'm doing it. But yeah, no, I think that's great insight into Harry's voice. And I love the, like, especially early in the story, he gets these long paragraphs that are all about this like philosophical nonsense about, like, I mean, his opening conversation is about how dark he is as a person. You know, I read the last page of the novel before I read the rest of the novel in case I die before I finish it. I want to know how it ends. It's great. But it's that, like, as the story evolves, you'll notice that his dialogue actually changes to be more about personal things. And he stops, like, it's almost like he's got this barrier up at the first of the story where he talks about philosophical things so that he doesn't actually ever have to be vulnerable. And then he has moments of vulnerability that force him in. Yeah. Any thoughts on Jess and Marie on the two? Yeah, go for it, Cassie. You don't have to raise your hand.
I
You just
feel
talk.
like I talk too much, so
No way.
I don't want to do that. So I feel like Jess and Marie are the exact opposites of Sally and Harry, and that's why their friendships worked. So, for example, Marie does the things that Harry philosophized about as being dark, since you just mentioned it, and Sally has this very high morality of herself, but she's friends with Marie, who's like sleeping with this guy who has a wife. And it just cracked me up. And then there's this switch where Marie has settled down into her morality of what that looks like. And then you can see that Sally is on the tipping point with Harry. And I thought they were great juxtapositions for both of those characters who are spiraling together. So I thought it was brilliant. So just a quick example of that. But the same thing with Jess and Harry. It's the exact same thing. He doesn't say a lot, but when he does, it's really impactful. And Harry's blah, 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 blah all the time, which kind of cracked me up.
Which is the same as Harry and Sally's relationship.
Yes.
Too, at the beginning,
so they're
right?
the
Like,
juxtapositions of each other. But the guys have their guy talk, right? That's relatable, and they love sports, right? So they have this thing. And then there's Marie and Sally, who I just seem like completely unlikely friends, but it was really interesting. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, it's a great example of what we talk about when we talk about like engine characters that are driving your protagonist to be the best version of themselves, right? Like Harry and Sally are each other's engines, but when they're not together, she puts other engines with them, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And it is funny, there's a dinner scene. I think I wrote it down. It's not 52, it must be 46. Where they meet up, all four of them meet at for the first time.
Oh, the blind date where they're trying to fix
stupid blind date. And you get this immediate connection between Jess and Sally, which this is one of the scenes added, by the way, that's not in the screenplay, is this scene actually starts earlier because we see the misconnection between Marie and Harry, where they're like trying to talk about how they're both from New Jersey. And like, never been to Hollyfield. It's nice. I'm sure it's great. Right? Like just the like dialogue of like, there's nothing happening here. And then they order, and here we get this moment where Harry actually explains to Jess that Sally is an amazing orderer, which is a massive change from the beginning of the book. Like his opinions about things modulating specifically about her. And then Marie quotes restaurants are to people in the 80s what theater was to people in the 60s. And Jess wrote it, and they have this immediate like connection. In the movie, there's an additional scene here where Jess is talking about what he likes to write, and he names an author. What she says, hey, Sally says something like, oh, that's so such and such this author. And he's like, well, that's, you know, he's the whole reason I got into writing, but that's not really important, I guess. And then he turns to Marie and talks to her, but it's missing from the screenplay. Oh no, here it is right here. No, that's not it. It is missing from the screenplay. But yeah, anyway, it's a but I like what you're pointing out there, Cassie, that they like balance each other out. But when you get those two, they serve as almost like an anchor to themselves. Does that make sense? Like when Sally is with Jess, it's like this pounding, they both kind of become the worst version of themselves. And when Marie is with Harry, and they both shut down because they have nothing to actually like play off of. But yeah, I love it. Did anybody catch the repeated scene for Marie? They're like, you're right, I know you're right. She's got this repeated phrase, which is another great way to develop a character voice, give them a repeated phrase they say all the time. I think she says it like 4 times throughout the.
Oh, about the guy leaving his wife.
Yeah, she's always like, he's never going to leave him. And Sally responds differently every time, but every time Sally says something of the instance of like, we all know he's never going to leave them. And then Marie always ends it with, you're right, I know you're right. And then like, yeah, it's a great like repeated phrase to like develop her characterization. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the characters or? All right, let's talk character growth. Oh, go for it.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I just had this, I know we already talked about Harry, but I had this experience where in the movie he was like so aggravating to me because he never could let anything like be said. He always had to go in there and like say his own piece, and he could never apologize.
Oh no, we lost you.
All those things. And then when I read this, I had these realizations.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. We just lost you for a second, but you're saying you had these realizations?
Okay. I just realized, oh, he's actually like deflecting anything that is emotional or real because I'm guessing he's like too vulnerable to do that or something. So I just realized that like you can have a character that is annoying in the moment, and then you can make the reader realize over time that there's much more actually going on.
How'd you feel about him at the end of the movie? Did your feelings on him change? Yeah.
Yes. No, because you actually, I mean, for one, Sally actually doesn't let him do all of his shit, and then but he also changes on his own. Like he actually listens, he actually asks questions and lets her answer. And like you can actually see that he begins to care about other people and lets it show. Like for him, I don't know, his voice was most distinctive to me, and also the change I think was biggest in my experience.
Yeah, I'd agree. Any other thoughts on any of the voices?
I thought that it was interesting to watch it because I knew there were going to be certain parts that would feel dated, but I felt like in general, the script, the dialogue, everything held up really well until the end when she says, Harry, I really hate you. And she's crying. I'm not sure that's the exact phrase, but it's something like that. And that was the only one where I thought it was just like, thunk. Like I kind of know what they were going for, but that was just the part where I thought, no, that's like the only line I would have not used.
Yeah. Anybody else have a feeling about the ending?
I think like I wanted more as to the resolution of it. Like not just in the movie, you know, where you have all those bit vignettes of the older couples. Like that was very cool, right? And then you get to them at their current age with the vignette at the end, but there wasn't like this moment. It wasn't big enough for me. Like I wanted to see the resolve of that. So I think that's like the only minor critique. Otherwise, I thought it was great to have the vignette. I almost just wish they were older. Like, since we started out with college and then we had the current day of, a few years, like I would
You
have
want them in
liked
like their
them.
60s or 70s?
Yeah, age them up.
That would have been
They
great.
should redo that now. Like, they should take the current Billy Crystal and the current Meg Ryan, and they should
And
do that.
oh, I
Do
would
that
watch it.
vignette and just put that vignette in
Yeah,
now with
and
them at
then,
their
like,
current ages. That would be fun.
Have a
Yeah.
similar story that's current today with vignettes of them through their, that
Yeah.
would be hilarious.
That'd be so funny. What did we think of the
So
vignette?
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I
go for
said,
it. No.
yeah, I just had a thought on the ending too, is that while Sally's transformation, I agree, does seem kind of quick. One thing that I thought was captured well in that scene is kind of the crux of them overcoming their own fears. And that's what, in any sort of romance or romantic comedy, when you have the grand gesture, that's really what makes the grand gesture grand, is the two characters overcoming their fears so they can come together. And so in Harry's case, he was kind of always this trickster that as soon as he got in a relationship where it was time to commit, he was afraid the person would leave him, and he always wanted to be the one to leave. And so he, in this scene, he was demonstrating through this long list of details about Sally that he could be sentimental instead of like the cynical person you see at the beginning. And then Sally, she wanted someone to be with her, to marry, and she was had her own fears, like when Joe was marrying someone else, she internalized it completely. And so in her case, the like, it's Harry, you say something like this and it's impossible to hate you, and I do hate you. She can be a little irrational, instead of like the rational contained person that she thought was like this liability against having someone say, and she could let go of that a little bit. And so that's kind of what I saw in that moment, when they connected.
Yeah, I love that interpretation. That's great. It's very cool. What did we think of the scripted vignettes that I thought were real couples the first probably 5 times I watched the movie? And
They
then
weren't?
no, they're in the screenplay. And then I read the screenplay for the first time. I was like, those are scripted? Yeah, anyway. What did y'all think of those?
The first one in the beginning, though, they said they wanted a genuine one, and all the rest after that were scripted.
Yeah.
I like them, and I don't know if anyone's watched Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but they do those vignettes in between as well. And I like that breakup, because it also in novels, I like that when, and I did it in my own, but I like when you're in different acts and you have like poetry or something in the middle that kind of sets up what's going to happen in the next one. Because if you paid attention to those vignettes, it told you exactly what was going to happen in those other scenes. Because none of them were perfect. Some of them were like, I've been married 10 times and her twice, like it kind of knew what was going to happen. So I love the vignettes. I thought they were a great tool. So.
Yeah, if you want to see somebody use that style really well with like completely different characters than are like she does here, Neil Gaiman in American Gods does it. He has vignettes in each act where you jump to a different god in a different part of the world, living a completely different life that you will never see again. And it just gives you this like there's a taxi cab driver who's a djinn, or there's I can't remember the other one. There's a woman who's a sex worker who's actually this god that like consumes her patrons. But like there's a Yeah, he does it too. He just drops these chapters in the middle of chapters that are like these interviews that are total vignettes that give you a hint to like, here's what's coming in the plot. But they're in like these, they're completely different characters that you don't engage with outside of these little vignettes. So if you want to think
I
about
think
like, oh, go for it, Maddie. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think my favorite use of vignettes was at the end of 6 Feet Under. Was anyone a 6 Feet Under fan? Well, it's about, I think I can say this without it being too much of a spoiler, but it's about a family that owns a mortuary. And so it always started out with somebody dying, you know, whoever the person body that was going to show up at their mortuary. That's how it started. Someone would die at the beginning, and then it was sort of like a family drama kind of thing. But in the last episode of the last season, they showed how all the main characters died. And it was fascinating because it gave you sort of, you know, you would become really, really emotionally invested in these characters, and every vignette implied how that character's life had panned out. And, you know, some of them were tragic and some of them were, you know, sort of wonderful in their own way. And, you know, probably none of them were more than like maybe 30 seconds long.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was cool.
That's very cool. Any other thoughts on the vignettes? Any other scenes we want to talk about that we haven't talked about?
I really like the scene with Jess and Marie where they're arguing about the wheel table.
The wagon wheel coffee table. Scene 52.
And they're like no at each other. And I started, the first time I saw it, I started getting nervous that like, oh no, things aren't working out for them. But as soon as like something happened that snapped them out of it, you know, you could tell they had a super healthy relationship because they could accommodate this kind of, I hate your table, you know, I can't believe you said that, to really banding together when they had an actual issue to address. Yeah,
Harry explodes. Is that like trigger that triggers them back? In the screenplay, he explodes. So you gotta remind me to share my screen or I won't. In the screenplay, we have him exploding, right? Where he's like yelling at them, like, you know, you're fighting over this now, but at some point, you know, you're going to be in front of a lawyer fighting over who gets this stupid wagon wheel coffee table. And then Jess, completely oblivious to his explosion, which is great, is like, I thought you liked it. It's like, I was being nice. And so he runs out, but then that line that you're talking about that lands so well is that like, I want you to know I'll never want that wagon wheel coffee table. It's so great. It's this part of what I love about what Ephron does is she sets up these scenes. Bachman, in his novel Anxious People and A Man Called Ove, is fantastic about this too. She sets up these scenes where they're talking about and doing something, but the story is actually about what's not being said. And then like you jump into what's happening. Like the other scene they do is the win, lose, or draw scene where Sally's drawing on the board and Harry and Jess. And it's really about how Sally, Harry, and Jess have found other partners and their relationship with these other partners. But they're at this like, you know, triple date party that's like the topic of the scene, but the content of the scene is actually about something else. In Anxious People, Bachman has a robbery going on, and you have all these a robbery and a hostage situation. You have all these moments where the hostages are sitting in an apartment and they're talking about the apartment, but what they're actually talking about is their lives and how they like connect with each other. And it's just really beautifully, I love those scenes that are just these beautifully done. Like, you know, we're talking about driving from Chicago to New York is the scene. And we're talking about kind of who we are and who we're going to be. But what we're really talking about is that we're both lonely, right? Like it's that like, and we're both scared of like the new life we're about to adventure on. So it's that, you know, having that subtext of conversation behind the conversation that's like the emotional, the exchange of emotions and expectations from the characters while they're talking about something else, I think makes for really fantastic dialogue. feels very
And I
rich
think
and deep.
it's interesting to see the script. Now I want to watch it again with the script in front of me, because there's no indication of how Marie says, I can assure you I'm never going to want that coffee table. And you can imagine Carrie Fisher delivering that in a very snarky way that was clear it was going to continue the argument.
Mhm.
But the way it's delivered in the movie is like they're sharing a joke, she and Jess
Yeah.
are sharing a joke, not like she's taking a shot at it.
Yeah, I think she actually like puts her arm on him. She like reaches out and touches him. And that's that burden we were talking about earlier about like the burden of us as a novelist versus a screenplay writer, is that the screenplay writer gets to drop the line, but then it's out of her control, right? Like now it's up to the director and the actors to interpret that line. But for a novelist, we actually have to convey that emotion through the body language and the way the other character responds and the connection and all that stuff. So it's, yeah, there's kind of a beautiful burden there on us to make that happen.
There was a lot of things that I liked about the scene in terms of voice too, in that Sally, like when they're pulling Sally and Harry into their argument and, asking them what they thought. And so, Sally, per the screenplay, gives one of her nose crinkles, right? She doesn't, want to come out and give her opinion on it. And then of course Harry explodes. But then when they're outside, and she's getting more upset with Harry, it's kind of, I thought it was interesting, like in terms of voice modulation, kind of like what you're talking about, where if you modulate a character's voice, you kind of change one aspect but then diminish another. She was kind of in the screenplay, they have her kind of trying to withdraw from the situation, like using body language again, like the nose crinkle, not to engage so much. So she was like heading back into the apartment, and then she was heading back out into the street at another point. But then she just lets Harry have it and says like, I haven't seen like sleeping with all these women, in New York, making, hell in a distant memory. And she goes and speaks for a very, very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was definitely like a change in her voice, and because it was like a change, and when it does happen, it draws attention to it, and really I felt pulls me into it as a viewer. But and then another difference though between the screenplay and the movie, and I thought that again, like the body language part they did better in the movie. Like in the screenplay, Harry just makes some off tangent joke about snapping turtles, right, to kind of end it, and then they're supposed to go back inside. But in the movie, as I recall, he just actually asks, are you through, and she says yes, and then he just apologizes, and they hug and they go back inside. And so I thought that was more effective personally, as far as like it's I think the first time you ever saw them actually hug, and a hug is more intimate than a kiss, I would argue, in a story. It really, like, again, body language showing their intimacy. I thought was anyway an interesting change that Ephron was able to do there, and then they actually changed in the movie as well. And then of course the reference joke with the wagon wheel, he pulls, he's dragging it outside and puts it on the curb at the end. That wasn't in the screenplay.
Yeah, and I think there's part of just playing off of that, part of what I love that Ephron does is she sets up these conversations and then plays them off later. So like you were talking about, like out of nowhere, it was seemingly out of nowhere, Sally brings up like, I don't see all these women that you're sleeping with like actually doing anything for you. They have a lot of those. Like he references at one point, they're just talking about how, well, it's her scene in the diner where she fakes the orgasm. To get into that, he's talking about what he does with a woman in the morning. And then Ephron plays that later after Harry and Sally have slept together, where like he gets up to leave, and it creates, because they've had the conversation early in the book, the moment really stings because it's like, oh, this is, and I think, that's one of the things I've learned from reading this screenplay and like paying attention to this, is that like punches are harder if you set them up early. and then play them out later in your novel. But yeah, like when they're standing out there on the curb too, that she can like recall, like, you've said these things to me.
I just have to ask if anybody's been to Katz's Delicatessen and seen the table.
No, is it there?
So,
Is
so
that a
that
real
scene
table?
was filmed in Katz's Delicatessen. Yeah, it's a real table. And there's like a little sign hanging over the table with an arrow that says, "This is the When Harry Met Sally table."
Oh, that's awesome. No, that's on my bucket list now, though.
Yeah,
We'll go
yeah,
find
it's
that.
fun.
Yeah. All right. Any other scenes we want to talk about or anything?
I just wanted to go back to the very beginning where they meet in the car. I kind of loved a lot of the car scenes because I thought those were really effective in setting up who the characters are and how they were going to be. Like, so I love things with character arc where you see where a person is and kind of defining in your mind what they are. And then at the end, who they end up being in reality. And so I found this like very superficial way of them meeting, which happens with all people, right? When you first get introduced. But I love that Harry was unabashedly, arrogantly himself to a fault. And I found it hilarious. I don't know if everybody else just laughed and laughed, but her responses of just big eyes and it was a constant every time he said something. And then she just got to the point where her mouth didn't open and it was just, the little click and the little shake of her head. I don't know. I really liked it. And the fact that she was hoping he didn't remember her at the airport.
That's hysterical.
Well, I love the part where he's kissing his girlfriend and she's kind of saying, "Oh, isn't that cute?" And then he keeps kissing her and she goes right from that to like on the horn. Like there's no in between. It's like, be polite. No, be polite.
Yeah. Oh, so funny.
And I guess that's sort of why I was disappointed in the very last line, because the Harry in the very last scene is so 180 degrees different than the Harry you meet when they're starting the trip. And I wanted the similar thing. I wanted Sally to respond in a way that was as different as opposed to, like, you could imagine the early Sally saying, "I hate you," crying and saying, "I hate you." I wanted it to be more different for her, like it was for him.
Yeah, I think what they were going for, and I agree, I don't think they fully pulled it off, but I think what Ephron's going for is actually her control and persona. So like at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the story, even when she leans on the horn, she plays it off like it's an accident. She's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." Like, whoops. And so but by the end, she's lost control and it's just kind of raw emotion. I think that's what the goal was for her character arc. I don't know that it landed, but I think it's about putting on the mask of control versus being raw and emotionally who she is on the inside. Her inside being outside is, yeah.
But don't you think in the middle, though, I found it interesting that Harry was the one that got madly in love and married and then left. And Sally was supposedly madly in love with her boyfriend, and he left her because she was a bit controlling, right? So, I mean, I found it interesting because his character arc automatically was changed in the middle. Hers was not, because she didn't change. She was just sad that she didn't get to keep her control, right? Yeah. And he was sad that I found it and then I lost it and I'm a schmuck because I didn't prescribe to my manipulative playboy mannerisms at the beginning. So I feel like his arc was the bigger one to watch actually than hers.
Yeah, I think it's definitely more blatant. I think her big change moment doesn't really come until 3/4 of the way through when they sleep together. And that's like her big, but I think you're right. I think it takes too long almost. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I have a question then. So if we were to write this as a novel, who would be the protagonist here? Would it be Harry? Because it's when Harry met Sally. not when Sally met Harry. So would he be the protagonist that we're following?
That's a
If
great
this-
question.
If this was like first point of view, because you know how it is in books, right? And I've coached various, authors where they're like, okay, I have all these different antagonists. I'm like, no, you got one. You only get one. So I kind of wonder when you read things from movie scripts, which I just recently started to do, like, who is the protagonist here? Is it Harry?
I think I mean, anybody else have an answer to that?
I would agree
Well-
in part because of Cassie, what you just said about him being the one that really has the most sort of interesting arc, I think.
Okay.
Well, I was thinking about the format of the romance format of what all those steps, and isn't he the first scene? Isn't he what we see kissing?
He's the first thing you see. Yeah.
And that's not like a rule, but it's kind of a rule. But he was the first thing, and then the meet cute would be when she pulls up and they're kissing and she's like, so was a simple thought about it.
So I think in terms of protagonist, viewpoint characters, and affected characters, and I would say that Harry definitely had the biggest change in terms of emotional arc, but the way Ephron structures this story, well, I'm sorry, hold on. It's like in terms of protagonist, like, so I'm sorry, affected character would be the one that goes through the change. I think they both go through change, but you're right, Harry goes through the most. A protagonist, in my definition of it, is simply the character with the most lines in the story. In this case, Ephron made like a clear structure where it mirrors both characters, and the viewpoint is with both characters as well. And so, I mean, it's almost like, it feels like almost like, a dual protagonist type situation in a novel where it's like, anyway, they as they both change together, it's just like first Sally, then Harry, then Sally, then Harry. It alternates that way almost, it feels like. So that's why I feel like it's more like a dual protagonist situation, because they have equal weight in terms of their lines and what we're exposed to.
Yeah, Rick Riordan does that with his Percy Jackson, the later Percy Jackson novels. You had Percy, Annabeth, Percy, Annabeth, Percy, Annabeth, like they go back and forth. From point of view chapters, they're constantly switching point of view chapters. Even when they're in each other's chapters, they're like flopping point of view. Yeah, I don't know, it's a fascinating question. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else about the story we want to talk about? Let's end this way. What is one thing you're inspired to try to take into your own writing? No
Well, I'm
inspiration?
really fascinated by the idea that we talked about really early on about how if I see this and I'm inspired by the idea of Sally's very exaggerated facial expressions, and portraying that on the page. I'm not sure I'm inspired to do it yet, but it would be an interesting writing challenge, because I think doing that on the page, you can only have so many times when another character says, you've got to stop mugging like that or your face will get stuck. It's like hard to, of course you can have the other character responding to the emotion, but I think just actually finding a way to indicate that a character's facial expression or some other physical thing is happening without it sounding really, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and saw her mouth was hanging open without having it be really awkward, I think would just be an interesting exercise.
Yeah, I would start it with a hazard character, like a character we're only going to see once or twice, and like really try to pop that character's body language in the scene and see how it works out. Yeah. Anything else y'all want to try?
I want to try to write a screenplay.
Nice. Very cool.
Well, I was inspired. I took a screenplay class a long time ago, but it wasn't it wasn't very helpful. And I think the instructor was half-assing it, to be quite honest. So yeah, I don't know. I was pretty motivated, and I like the idea of drafting via a screenplay, because I think I'm very dialogue heavy anyway in how I think about story. And then I like the idea of crafting the nuances around it, because as I was reading and watching, part of that challenge for me was I was reading it, but I was seeing it how they were acting it. You know what I mean? Versus a lot of times when I read novels, I put my own nuances into what I'm reading. I'm sure that will devastate most authors, but like, even when I've already decided what the person looks like and they've told me, I'm like, no, that's not who he looks like. And it's already in my head. And, you know, that's how I've done it. And if it's a movie in my head at that point. So I was kind of doing the same thing. And I don't know if it was a flavor of, I had already seen the movie several times earlier in my youth. So as reading it, I already had those nuances, but that's kind of, I don't know. I've been challenged really hard in my current work in progress. And I think dialogue just really helps me.
Nice.
So
Yeah, when we coach people to write, like you may have heard me talk to people about writing a dialogue only first draft.
yeah,
We're pretty much just telling you to write a screenplay. When Laura and I do that, it's like, yeah, just write a screenplay first and then come back behind the screenplay and fill everything else in, because it forces you to get all of your scenes dialogue centric, which is super.
it's interesting because when I started my outline, and granted, I wrote this outline 5 years ago, which anyway, so when I saw a lot of pieces in my outline where it's just dialogue, you know, where you have between characters when you're just trying to figure out your story and where it's going. So I find that really interesting, how that really pushes momentum of characters. So
I'm inspired by repeated scenes. So so you're talking about the repeated scenes showing how Sally changes, and then also the vignettes. The story ends as it begins with Harry and Sally having their own vignette. So that seems like a very powerful technique that I'm interested in trying.
I will say I have yet to find a story that we as like a you know, corporate voice consider great that doesn't have repeated scenes in it. I have yet to find one. They all have them. Usually, like typically at the beginning and the end, but a lot of writers use them all the way through. They just like every time there's a big moment you want to create change, put these two people in a similar place, having a similar conversation so that we can show how they've changed through their dialogue. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say I'm inspired to not be afraid to go big with voices.
Yeah.
Like, so that even in scenes where maybe externally there isn't that much actually happening, like characters are sitting in a car or at a table or something, but even then it's entertaining to watch, to read.
Yeah, go huge. I love it.
Yeah, and then one more thing I think I'm inspired. I noticed in the screenplay that she often has in the dialogue, it says like beat or something, that she plays with these like these pauses that give it more weight or something.
She used a lot of
I'd like
silence.
to try that.
Yeah, that's fun. I know for me, I am dreaming while I have those 2 nonfiction books to write, but once I'm done with them, I'm currently dreaming about a sci-fi novel that is for friends, and one of them is an android, the others don't know it. I really am captured by the idea. Reading it through this time, I was like, I love that it's you never see their lives. It's just the 4 people talking about their lives. And I'm really interested in trying to pull that off, where like you never actually see these 4 friends at work, but they're constantly talking about work. So I'm really interested to like see if I can pull that off in an entertaining way, but we'll see. Yeah,
that was really interesting, because I had this moment of thinking that I was feeling shortchanged, or that I felt like I should feel shortchanged because I didn't get to really understand what Sally's profession, what her life outside her romantic interest was.
Mhm.
And then I realized exactly the same thing was true with Harry. So it wasn't like they were playing favorites, but it wasn't really, I wasn't feeling like an emotional need. I was just curious about it, but I think
Yeah.
the decision not to go there was a good one.
And their lives are interesting. She's a journalist for the New Yorker, and he's a political consultant. Like they have
exactly.
fascinating jobs. They that's not what the story's about. So part of me, like, I really love that she did that she stayed focused on what the story was about. We don't have all these weird scenes of roaming through Sally's office, meeting characters we don't care about, or Harry having some kind of like consultant with some politician that we don't care about. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining, y'all. We're a little over, so I'll close this out. But I think our next one, I think we're doing 2 short stories next. So I think it's like next week. It's coming up really quick. So I'll send out an email to the Patreon to let everyone know. But thanks for jumping in. I appreciate it.
So much fun.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right.